Next up, Darcy Watchorn from Deakin University to talk artificial refuges. Doctor. Not yet, sorry. Oh.
Hopefully soon, though. Doctor, that title means absolutely everything to me, Jack. It's the only reason I did the thing. Okay. Hello, everyone. So my talk today is based on the breadth of work that I've been involved with throughout my PhD here in the Otways. And I'm pleased to say that I submitted the thesis about 6 weeks ago. Thank you. So before I begin, I'd like to extend a really big thank you to my wonderful supervisors, Tim Doherty, as well as Barb Wilson and Mark Arkarklis, who I'm sure a lot of you know well, as well as Don Driscoll. I would not have made it this far alive without their fantastic support. Now, the title of my talk today is Artificial Refuges for Conserving Native Mammals After Fire, and the 4-year journey of one man's desperate struggle with Deakin's reimbursement process. But today I'm going to focus more on the first part of that title. I'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung, Gudubadud and the Wonkunguru people as the traditional custodians of the lands where the fieldwork for these projects was undertaken. And I'll also acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Wadjuk people as the custodians of the lands where I toiled away on my laptop for far, far too long these past few years. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. Okay, so my PhD research can be split into two broad themes or parts, with part one being cats, foxes and fire, and part two artificial refuges. And so this work is a combination of about 6 different papers. So I'm going to give a really highly simplified and brief overview of this work. But more than happy to dive into some detail with some questions, or come and chat to me at morning tea or something afterwards. So for part one, we wanted to improve our understanding of how cats and foxes respond to fire, particularly in temperate ecosystems like here in the Otways. And then in part two, we explored the potential of artificial refuges for wildlife conservation, and we then tested the response of small mammals to their provision after fire. So as you've likely heard, there's growing concern from across the country suggesting that cat and fox activity may be increased in burnt landscapes shortly after fire. Likely because their hunting success has improved in the simplified habitat. And it's easier for them to see and to catch prey. Now, the strongest evidence for this interaction comes from a bunch of studies led by Hugh McGregor from tropical northern Australia about 10 years ago. And since then, there's been several studies from different ecosystems across the country testing this idea, including some from the Otways, but they've kind of produced varying results. So it's unclear whether increased cat and fox activity after fire is a general phenomenon or something that's more context specific. So the first study, as part of this series, was a review of the literature with meta-analysis, which was led by Tim Doherty and published in Fire Ecology last year. Now, I'll just say that the QR codes in the corner will take you to each of these relevant papers, but I'm more than happy to share them with anyone if you would like. So we reviewed and analysed 16 studies which looked at the changes in cat and fox activity after fire right across the country. And we included variables like fire type, climate type and time since fire in these mixed effect models, along with things like survey period and the study design. Now, what did we find? So we did not find widespread evidence of cats and foxes increasing their activity after fire. But as you can see from the maps with the cat at the top and the fox at the bottom, we found a real mix of responses. So the green circles represent increased activity after fire, the purple triangles, decreased activity, and the grey squares were sort of neutral responses or no real response observed. However, cat activity was more likely to increase after fire in tropical ecosystems, so right up north, while foxes, or for foxes, wildfire was most likely to result in decreased activity and prescribed burns were most likely to result in increased activity. However, we did not find widespread evidence of these species increasing their activity in temperate regions, like the Otways and up the east coast, despite the general concern for this phenomenon. Notably though, for both species, increased activity after fire was more likely to be observed shortly after fire. So the probability of detecting increased activity for the cat decreased from 41% at 0 months post-fire down to 10% at 100 months post-fire. And for foxes, this trend was from 53% immediately post-fire down to 10%. So further studies are really needed to help grow the knowledge base, or this knowledge base, particularly those studies that begin sampling shortly after fire, so sort of less than 1 month, or ideally a couple of days or weeks after fire, as well as in temperate ecosystems. Okay, so that brings us to paper number 2, where we experimentally tested, using a Bachy design, how cat and fox activity changed in response to fire in a temperate ecosystem. This work was also published earlier this year. So this was undertaken in the Currawong Falls area, so just north of Aries Inlet. We conducted surveys at 6 and 2 months pre-fire, and then again at 2 weeks, 3 months and 6 months post-fire, and each of the survey periods was about 2 months in length. As you can see, the fire here was quite patchy, and only 12 of the 30 camera trap sites were actually burnt by the prescribed fire. We did initially plan on this experiment being both spatially and temporally sort of much larger, but sort of COVID spoiled those plans, unfortunately. We fitted some generalised linear mix models and tested a variety of vegetation, topographic, prey abundance variables and how they affected the detection frequency or activity of cats and foxes. And what did we find? We found no response of cats to this prescribed fire. And fox activity, on the other hand, was higher after the prescribed fire, but this was across both burnt and unburnt sites. So due to the proximity of our control sites and our treatment sites, it's very possible that this wasn't actually driven by fire itself and potentially a different mechanism like the dispersal of juvenile foxes, which generally happens in this region at this time of year. So for me, a key conclusion of this study and of the literature review as well is that having cats and foxes wearing GPS loggers and, if possible, animal-borne cameras on their collars before and immediately after fire events is really needed to reliably observe any short-lived or fine-scale changes in movement patterns and hunting success. So this has been done by Hugh McGregor and his team up north, where they found that cats would make these really lengthy, up to 20 or 30 Ks, these really lengthy forays to the edges of fire scars that hang around there for a couple of days, then they'd head back. They also fitted cameras on their collars, and they found that cats were much better hunters in these open, structurally simple habitats. And that's the footage that we're seeing here. Unfortunate rodent getting nailed. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the data that Mark Leplar is collecting his PhD, because I think some of that falls into this realm. Okay, so now we move on to part 2, just artificial refuges. So very quickly, I'll give you a brief overview of what they are. We published a review a couple of years ago where we described them as human-made substitutes for depleted natural habitat structures in modified and degraded environments. So they typically aim to maintain or improve the survival, growth, reproduction or abundance of your target species, whatever that may be. And they're being used with increasing frequency across marine and freshwater and terrestrial environments for a breadth of species, from salamanders to albatross to handfish and possums and bats and you name it. So in another review led by Mitch Cowan from CSU, we found that the most common terrestrial examples of artificial refuges are nest boxes, unsurprisingly, as well as bat boxes and artificial burrows, with birds far and away the most popular target taxa. But importantly, this review found that only 39% of artificial refuges used experimental controls, and only 10% of these studies used a Bachy design. So as a consequence, there's very few studies of artificial refuges where we can confidently determine the overall success or overall effect on the actual target populations. So in my PhD, we wanted to take this concept of artificial refuge provision and apply it to recently burnt areas for small ground-dwelling mammals that may be facing an elevated risk of cat and fox predation after fire. So first of all, we conducted a control impact camera trap study in the Otways, that same study area just north of Aries, as well as on Kangaroo Island and the Simpson Desert. And this research was also published just earlier this year. So our artificial refuges were these wire tunnels constructed from chicken wire, covered in shade cloth, and they range from either 25 metres or 50 metres in length. And there were no larger openings in these tunnels, so only animals that could fit through the 5 centimetre gaps in the wire could enter, and the idea is that they can enter and exit these refuges from any point, so the behaviour, in theory, doesn't become predictable to predators. Now, I'll say that the design for these refuges came from the beautiful mind of Chris Dickman, who constructed these about a decade ago, originally in the Simpson Desert. So we built a total of 76 artificial refuge tunnels across these 3 study areas, including 40 in the Currawong Falls area, just north of Aries, which is 2 kilometres worth of tunnels. So an awful lot of blood, sweat and tears involved in building these and then bringing them in. And I'd like to thank, give my thanks to Pat O'Shea, Aaron Ledden and Hamish Martin and a whole host of other Deakin Park staff for their assistance and with logistics and all of the field work. Now, we placed a camera trap in the middle of each of these tunnels and then a paired camera, a control camera nearby, and we left the cameras in situ for up to 40 months. Wow, okay, sorry. Skipped way ahead. Okay, so we found that activity was much higher inside the refuges for a breadth of species, particularly small skinks and birds, such as the painted button quail, which you can see in that video, which isn't playing. Now it's playing. And we had heaps of fairy wrens and scrub wrens as well. Small mammals showed mixed responses, with about 2/3 of the species showing no response at all to the artificial refuges. Although the kangaroo island dunart and the bushrat had higher activity inside the refuges, and the kangaroo island dunart was the species driving the implementation of the refuges on the island, so that was a good result. So these findings suggest that this method may have some merit as a conservation tool, but we need further studies that test their impact on population level metrics like survival or abundance, to understand if these activity-based data actually translates to improved population persistence, which is sort of the key outcome. And so that brings us to the final study, and we undertook a live trapping Backie experiment again in the Currawong Falls area near Aries Inlet, and we had 3 treatments. So we had 5 unburnt sites, 8 burnt sites without artificial refuges, and then 7 burnt sites with the artificial refuges, and these are the same refuges from the previous study. And we tested their effect on 3 response variables, so agile antechinus abundance, bushrat abundance, and then overall small mammal species richness. And sites were surveyed over 12 months, so we surveyed them twice before the fire and 3 times after the fire, and we fitted generalised linear mix models, which included variables like prescribed fire and a whole host of microhabitat variables as well. And what did we find? Well, unfortunately, we found no effect of the artificial refuges on small mammal abundance or richness, alas. However, as we expected, we did find that bushrat abundance decreased after fire. This is not terribly surprising, and antechinus and bushrat abundance were positively associated with habitat complexity. Again, this was expected. So these findings suggest that artificial refuge design, or this design specifically, may not be an effective tool for improving small mammal population persistence after fire, despite them being readily used, and as such won't yet advocate for their broader application. However, given the sort of inherent context dependency of field experiments like these and the influence of factors like fire size and fire severity, predator activity, and the prey population dynamics as well, we definitely encourage researchers to undertake further experiments with artificial refuges after fire, including testing alternative designs and after severe wildfire or particularly hot prescribed burns where there's less vegetation cover remaining in the system. So, back to this slide. Big thank you to the many project contributors. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you to Jack and Lizzie, the CEC, for putting today together.